He became a king, although he did not aspire to the throne. He fought in the Holy Land, although he could have easily ruled from London. Saladin himself respected him, and his death became the beginning of a legend. Today, we will tell the story of a man whose name became synonymous with the bravery of Rechard the Lionheart. In this video, you will learn why Rechard betrayed his own father, how he found himself in the very center of the Third Crusade, why Jerusalem was never conquered by him, but glory still remained with him, and why his heart is buried separately from his body. But most importantly, you will see how this man became a legend. Rechard the Lionheart, knight, king, warrior, and symbol of an entire era. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories are published here every day. On September 8th, 1957, a boy was born in the royal palace in Oxford who was destined to go down in history under the name of Rechard the Lionheart. He was the third surviving son of Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman who was as ambitious, apt, and influential as her husband. His birth did not cause a political sensation. His elder brother, Henry the Young, was considered the heir, and no one yet knew what role the younger Rechard would play in the fate of the empire. But the blood that flowed in his veins united two powerful dynasties. His father, the ruler of the Angevin dynasty, bore the title of King of England, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. His mother, the Duchess of Aquitaine, a woman of exceptional power and education, was once the Queen of France, and then the Queen of England. In return, she brought her husband vast territories in the south of France, making him the ruler of a vast Anglo-Norman empire that stretched from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees. Rechard was born into a family where politics were inseparable from personal feelings. Henry II was famous for his stern disposition and cold calculation, while Eleanor was distinguished by her love of freedom, sharp mind, and desire to participate in government. Their union, cemented by politics, was full of conflicts and hidden rivalry. In such an atmosphere, the future heirs, Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, were formed. The eldest, Henry the Young, received the crown during his father's lifetime, but did not receive power. Geoffrey became the Duke of Brittany. John was not destined for land, and for this, he would receive the nickname Unmercenary. And Rechard, it seemed, had to be content with the role of ruler of Aquitaine. The childhood of the future king was spent not in England, but in France, mainly in Anjou and Aquitaine. From an early age, he absorbed the spirit of the southern lands, proud, independent, musical. These lands were famous for their knightly traditions, troubadours, songs of love and valor, as well as the difficult relations between overlords and vassals. Eleanor, who knew these lands very well, made a lot of efforts to ensure that her son got used to their customs and learned how to govern them. Rechard's education included not only knightly training, but also humanitarian knowledge. He studied Latin, history, theology, learned to compose poetry in the Languedoc language, and play musical instruments. At the same time, he began to study military affairs, fencing, horse riding, and archery early. All this was part of the obligatory training of a prince who was to govern the lands and, possibly, wage war. His mother played a special role in Rechard's life from a young age. After Eleanor fell out of favor with her husband and was effectively under house arrest, she still retained influence in her southern possessions. Rechard, who was given to her for upbringing, became her favorite son, and it was to her that he largely owed his understanding of power, culture, and sense of personal dignity. Eleanor did everything to prepare him for the rule of Aquitaine, and soon he was considered the future duke of these lands. When Rechard turned 12, his father formally granted him the title of Duke of Aquitaine. This gesture was not only a manifestation of trust, but also part of a complex political game of Henry II, who tried to balance the ambitions of his sons while maintaining control over their lands. In fact, the young duke received not power, but responsibilities to pacify local barons, fight rebellions, and build relationships with difficult vassals. All this became a real school of governance for Rechard. He learned not from books, but in life. Chronicles mention that, as a teenager, he participated in the suppression of the baronial uprising in Sengge. There he first encountered betrayal and the unreliability of allies, saw that military valor is only part of power and that politics requires flexibility, patience, and calculation. These impressions taught him caution and fortitude early on. At the same time, his talent as a poet and singer developed. Many contemporaries noted that Richard had mastered the art of composing and performing songs no worse than professional troubadours. One of these songs, written much later in captivity, has come down to us and testifies to his poetic gift and spiritual depth. This is one side of Richard's personality. The rare combination of warrior and poet added charm to him and made him especially popular among the knights. By the age of 15, Richard was already a mature young man, tall, stately, with reddish hair and a piercing gaze. He was respected for his military skills, decisiveness, and straightforwardness. He was not inclined to diplomatic politeness and preferred to say what he thought. This made an impression, especially against the background of the courtiers, intrigue, and ambiguity that reigned at the court of Henry II. While his elder brother, Henry the Younger, received empty titles and participated in ceremonies, Richard learned to rule a rebellious province by doing. It was here in southern France that he found his independence, realized his own power, and began to see his destiny, not as a secondary prince, but as a leader. By the time he came of age, he was no longer perceived as a younger brother. He was the Duke of Aquitaine, albeit in name, and a man whose opinion had to be taken into account. His future was beginning to take shape, and within him, a maturing sense of his own calling was preparing for his first open clash with his father. In the second half of the 10th century, the empire of Henry II Plantagenet seemed strong and unshakable, but behind its facade of greatness, internal cracks were already beginning to appear. The king, who controlled England, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and Aquitaine, dreamed of a lasting dynastic legacy. However, he himself had planted the seeds of discord in his family. He thought that if each son were given a title and a portion of his lands, but not given full power, they could be balanced against each other. But he underestimated their ambitions and the intensity with which each of them craved to be more than just a prince in the shadow of their father. In 1170, Henry proclaimed his eldest son, Henry the Young, king while his father was alive, not with the intention of passing on power to him, but rather as a gesture of political symbolism. This decision only exacerbated the tension. The young king had a crown, but no income, no real governance, and Henry II, still in control of all the key territories, was in no hurry to cede anything from his vast domain. In these circumstances, the first major rebellion against the king broke out 3 years later. It was initiated by 3 sons, Henry the Young, Richard, and Geoffrey, with the support of their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. The cause of the rebellion was the desire of the sons to obtain their shares of power and disagreement with the fact that their father was trying to endow the younger John with lands without providing anything to the others. Eleanor, concerned about the infringement of the rights of her older sons and the strengthening of John's influence, supported the rebellion and tried to escape from her husband's supervision, but was captured on the way and imprisoned, where she would remain for many years. Richard acted in this rebellion mainly within the borders of Aquitaine. He was already recognized as a duke and considered these lands his legitimate authority. He strengthened castles, gathered troops, and negotiated with local barons, promising them support and autonomy. In Poitiers, in the castle where his grandfather Helios Zax once ruled, he prepared for defense and counted on support from Paris. The French king, Louis VI, Eleanor's former husband, supported the rebels, seeking to weaken English influence in France. However, Henry II's campaign was decisive. He marched with an army through Normandy and gradually began to suppress the rebellion. He managed to get the barons to switch sides and also took advantage of the fact that the rebellion was poorly organized. Richard, like his brothers, was forced to admit defeat and lay down his arms. Henry, in the spirit of his pragmatic rule, forgave his sons, but this forgiveness was formal. Eleanor remained imprisoned, John received lands, and the eldest sons lost their hopes of independent rule. After the rebellion, Richard returned to Aquitaine, but not as a rebel, rather as a representative of royal power. Henry II instructed him to restore order in the southern lands. Here, Richard proved himself not only as a ruler, but also as a tough commander. He suppressed the rebellion with particular determination, punishing those who stood against him. The chronicles tell us that, in one episode, he besieged a castle in which rebellious vassals had taken refuge, and, after their capitulation, he ordered it to be razed to the ground to show that the Duke of Withan intended to rule without weakness. Richard's harshness displeased the barons, but strengthened his control. He built castles, led campaigns to subdue the rebellious lords, and gradually achieved that even the old Aquitanian families began to perceive him not as an outsider Angevin, but as the legitimate suzerain. Meanwhile, the struggle for influence continued in England and Normandy. Henry the Young, still deprived of real power, rebelled again, but this time without Richard's support. Moreover, the brothers clashed with each other. Henry wanted to take Richard's quittance away in order to expand his own possessions. Richard refused to submit. In response, Henry the Younger invaded his lands, but soon fell ill with dysentery and died at the age of 28. His death opened up a new perspective for Richard. He was now the eldest surviving son of the king, and therefore the direct heir to the entire empire. But Henry II was in no hurry to make him the official heir. He hoped to retain control over all the lands through his youngest, and, as it seemed to him, most manageable son. Richard, realizing that there was no time to waste, began to strengthen ties with external allies. He swore allegiance to the new King of France, Philip II Augustus, as his suzerain in Normandy and Aquitaine. This step was, in fact, an open break with his father. Henry II now found himself in a position where his own son had entered into an alliance with England's main enemy. Moreover, Richard and Philip began joint actions against the English garrisons in France. This became the final act in a drama in which father and son ceased to be political allies. Meanwhile, news of the fall of Jerusalem spread across Europe. The news shook the Christian world, and Pope Clement II called for a new Third Crusade. Richard, a knight in spirit, a poet at heart, and a warrior by vocation, was one of the first to publicly give a dinner to go to the East. Perhaps there were religious feelings, a desire to become famous, and political calculation in this decision. Becoming a crusader meant occupying a special position in which any internal conflicts retreated in the face of the task of liberating the Holy Land. But before Richard could set out on a campaign, he would have to face one more decisive battle against his own father. By the early 1990s, the confrontation between Richard and his father had entered its final phase. After decades of tense relations, mutual suspicions, and political intrigue, it became clear that dynastic power could no longer coexist with the personal will of each of them. Henry II, despite his failing health, continued to stubbornly hold on to control of the empire and avoided formally recognizing Richard as his heir. On the contrary, he encouraged his younger son John and tried to set him against his elder brother, hoping to maintain a balance through feuding between the sons. Richard, realizing that there was no other way to power, entered into an alliance with Philip II, the young, energetic King of France, who was not averse to weakening England's influence on the continent. Richard swore fealty to Philip for Normandy and Aquitaine, an act that was almost treason from the point of view of the English crown. But from a political point of view, a precise and measured step, the joint military actions of the two allies forced Henry II to retreat and sign an agreement recognizing Richard as heir. 2 days later, sick, broken, and betrayed even by his beloved John, the king died in the castle of Chinon. Richard was 31 years old. He became the King of England, the Duke of Normandy, Aquitaine, and Anjou, inheriting one of the largest territorial empires in Europe. But unlike his father, he did not strive for permanent control of this empire. His heart was turned to the east. The Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, captured by Saladin, became for him a goal worthy of the sword. The idea of a crusade was combined in him with personal ambitions, a knightly ideal, and a desire for immortal glory. The coronation took place on September 3, 1189, in Westminster Abbey. The celebration was organized according to all the canons, with the participation of archbishops, bishops, and knightly nobility. Richard, dressed in purple, solemnly placed the crown on himself and pronounced oaths corresponding to the status of a Christian king. But this day was remembered not only for the pomp of the ceremony. The day before, Richard ordered that Jews not be allowed to participate in the celebration, fearing accusations of sympathy for the murderers of Christ. However, several representatives of the Jewish community still arrived with gifts and were rudely expelled. The next day, pogroms broke out in London. Crowds of citizens attacked Jewish homes, killed, robbed, and burned. Richard, having learned of this, ordered an end to the violence and punishment of the instigators, but unrest continued in other cities. This became a dark background for the beginning of his reign. Almost immediately after the coronation, Richard officially confirmed his intention to take part in the Third Crusade. Philip II remained his ally, and the third participant was to be the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick Barbarossa, who had already set out. However, Frederick soon drowned while crossing a river in Asia Minor, and his army fell apart. Thus, the main burden of the campaign fell on Richard and Philip. Enormous funds were needed to prepare for the war. Richard sold everything that could bring in income: lands, positions, titles, and city charters. According to contemporaries, he allegedly joked that he would even sell London if a buyer were found. The main source of funding was the so-called Saradin tithe, a tax obliging all subjects of the king, including the clergy, to give 1/10 of their income to the needs of the Holy Land. These measures caused discontent, but were extremely effective. Richard's army became one of the most powerful and well-equipped in the history of the Crusades. Richard appointed William Langshan, Bishop of Ely, a loyal but unpopular man, as his governor in England during his absence. He also demanded that John, his younger brother, swear allegiance and not interfere in the affairs of state. However, the king still felt that, in his absence, a power struggle could begin in England, and therefore tried to build the strongest possible system of control. In the spring of 1190, Richard left England. He crossed the English Channel, visited Normandy, and moved to the southern ports of France where the fleet was gathering. In August, he met Philip II at Vézelay, where they solemnly confirmed the alliance. Then each went his own way. Richard went to Marseille, from where he sailed to Sicily. There he encountered his first diplomatic problem. The local ruler, Tancred, refused to release his sister Joanna, the widow of the late King William of Sicily. In addition, the money laid down as a loyalty was not paid. In September, Richard occupied the city of Messina, a show of military force. He set up his camp near the walls of the city, negotiated, and freed his sister. In gratitude for freeing Joanna, he was paid significant amounts of money. However, his actions caused discontent among the locals and tensions between the allies. Philip, not approving of the capture of Messina, soon sailed to the Holy Land on his own. Richard stayed in Sicily until the spring of 1191, after which he set off. On the way, his fleet was caught in a storm, and some of the ships were washed ashore on Cyprus. The local ruler, the usurper Isaac Komnenos, did not provide assistance to the shipwrecked. This became the reason for a quick military campaign. Richard landed on the island, defeated the troops, captured the ruler, and took control of Cyprus. The island became an important supply base and rear for the army. The wedding of Richard and Berengaria of Navarre took place in Cyprus. Although almost nothing is known about the love between them, this marriage was advantageous from a political point of view. It strengthened the alliance with Navarre and provided the king with a worthy spouse. However, Berengaria never arrived in England and played virtually no role in her husband's policies. In early June, Richard left Cyprus and headed for Acre, a city besieged by the Crusaders who held Muslim garrisons. Philip and many European warriors were already waiting for him there. Ahead of Richard were the battles that would glorify his name for centuries. When Richard's fleet approached the shores of the Holy Land, the siege of Acre had already lasted for almost 2 years. The city, the most important port of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, was under the control of a Muslim garrison, but the Crusaders, who had gathered from all over Europe, could not take it for a long time. The French king had already arrived earlier. His troops were camped in front of the walls, but the siege dragged on, and the camp was ravaged by disease, heat, and lack of coordinated command. The arrival of Richard the Lionheart, well prepared with a combat-ready army, brought new order and determination to the besieging ranks. Rechard devoted the first days after the landing to strengthening the camp's defenses, organizing supplies, and reconnaissance of positions. He inspected the surrounding area personally, gave orders for the construction of new siege engines, monitored discipline in the ranks of his army, and quickly brought it to combat readiness. His warriors, English, Norman, and mercenary troops, were distinguished by good training and subordination. Their appearance increased the morale of all Christian forces. Philip II, feeling that with the arrival of Rechard he was losing his primacy, soon distanced himself from active participation in the assault. After several weeks of formal cooperation, he left for France, leaving a small detachment under the command of the Duke of Burgundy. Thus, command passed into the hands of Rechard, and it was he who was tasked with completing the operation. Rechard acted energetically. He restored and strengthened the siege works, put the throwing machines in order, and built new towers. Under his command, the walls were fired upon daily by catapults, and the foundations of the towers were dug under the cover of shields and archers. He himself often appeared at the front, talked with engineers, and even participated in aiming the throwing machines. Chronicles note that his personal participation instilled confidence in ordinary soldiers and inspired the knights. The siege progressed slowly, but surely. In early July, the walls of Acre began to crumble. The defenders, not expecting help, offered to capitulate. According to the agreement, they were obliged to hand over the city, return the relic, the true cross, release about 1,500 Christian prisoners, and pay a significant ransom. In return, Rechard had to spare the garrison. The city surrendered on July 12, 1191. Saladin, who was nearby with the main forces of his army, confirmed his agreement to the terms, but delayed the implementation. Over the next month, he did not hand over the prisoners, did not pay the gold, and did not return the relic. Rechard sent ambassadors and delayed the deadlines, but at the end of August, his patience was exhausted. In full view of the city walls, from where Saladin could observe what was happening, Rechard ordered the execution of about 3,000 Muslim prisoners. This was a demonstration of determination. The king believed that failure to fulfill the treaty jeopardized the credibility of further negotiations and undermined the authority of the Christian camp. The execution, carried out in an organized and public manner, caused horror and condemnation among the allies. But Rechard remained steadfast in his decision. After taking Acre, he did not linger. He strengthened the garrison in the city, established supplies, and began preparations for a march along the coast toward Jaffa. This direction was chosen with calculation. Advancing along the coastal strip allowed for naval support and avoided deep penetration into Palestine, where Saladin's army could impose less favorable terms of battle. On September 7th, when the troops were marching in battle formation along the forests between Caesarea and Arsuf, the attack began. Saladin's army fell upon the rearguard. Arrows, shouts, rapid cavalry raids. Muslim warriors attacked, disappeared, and returned again, trying to disorganize the formation. Rechard had prepared his commanders in advance. The infantry marched in dense columns. The knights were ready to repel onslaughts. Crossbowmen covered the flanks. He waited, not allowing himself to be drawn into an impulsive fight. When the onslaught intensified and the Templar detachment launched a counterattack on its own initiative, Rechard did not stop them. He saw an opportunity in this and ordered a general offensive. In the center of the battle formation, he personally stood at the head of the knightly cavalry and led it to break through. The blow was crushing. The Muslim army wavered, tried to regroup, but under the pressure of the heavy cavalry, began to retreat. The bodies of hundreds of fallen soldiers remained on the fields of Arsuf. And for the first time since the beginning of the campaign, the Crusaders won a convincing victory in open combat. The Battle of Arsuf was a turning point. It demonstrated that the Christian army was capable of fighting in an organized manner, withstanding blows and delivering counterattacks. The victory raised morale, strengthened Rechard's position as the undisputed leader of the campaign, and created a new strategic foothold, the city of Jaffa, where the army soon arrived. Richard spent several weeks there, strengthened the defenses, established supplies, and began to prepare for a new stage, the march to Jerusalem. But before he could march on the Holy City, he had to understand that victory on the battlefield was not always enough to achieve his goal. There were not only battles ahead, but also difficult negotiations, because on the other side of the desert stood a ruler who was unbroken by defeat and too smart to allow himself another. After the victory at Arsuf and the capture of Jaffa, Richard the Lionheart's campaign reached a new stage. Military action gave way to a more complex and sophisticated struggle: diplomacy. Richard's main opponent remained Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, a ruler known in Europe as Saladin, who not only commanded one of the strongest armies in the Islamic world, but also had authority that extended from Egypt to Syria. He was an experienced commander, a devout Muslim, and a politician who knew how to unite the conflicting interests of rulers and tribes. Despite the defeat at Arsuf, Saladin was not defeated. His troops remained combat-ready. The fortresses in central Palestine had not surrendered, and the army's morale remained high. He knew that the front had stabilized, but the threat of an assault on Jerusalem was becoming more and more real. Richard, for his part, saw that the Christian army was tired, its numbers were dwindling, and supplies were becoming difficult as it advanced deeper into the country. In this environment, a series of negotiations began that involved much more than an exchange of peace terms. Richard, unlike some of the Western barons, treated Saladin with respect. He did not perceive him as a savage or an infidel, but rather as an equal, a ruler waging war in the name of faith and political duty. This respect was felt in the tone of the messages and the diplomatic formulations. There were no curses, malice, or arrogance, only firmness, persistence, and an understanding that he faced a strong opponent. Saladin responded in kind. He admired Richard's personal bravery, noted his honesty in battle, simplicity in everyday life, and straightforwardness in negotiations. In the chronicles of Muslim authors, he is mentioned as Malik Anuja, the Night King. He was described as a man who ate the same food as his soldiers, slept in field conditions, did not complain about hardships, and did not demand exquisite comforts. Such restraint inspired respect even among those who considered him an enemy. During the protracted negotiations between them, a tone was established that chroniclers later called mutual nobility. Although they never met in person, there was a constant diplomatic channel between them through emissaries, clergy, translators, and family members. According to legend, a possible dynastic union was even discussed. Saladin allegedly proposed marrying his brother to Richard's sister, Joanna, in order to hand over Jerusalem to them both as a symbol of unity. However, historians consider this story a late invention, dating back to the 10th century. No such plans are recorded in the chronicles of the time of the Crusade. Nevertheless, diplomatic politeness was accompanied by real gestures. When Richard fell ill, probably with malaria or typhus, Saladin sent him a doctor and baskets of ice and fruit. When the Muslim commander lost his sword, Richard returned it through intermediaries. These episodes were not a demonstration of friendship, but reflected the code of conduct adopted by rulers who sought to demonstrate not only strength, but also personal culture. At the same time, hostilities did not cease. Richard did not sit idle. He strengthened the defense of Jaffa, made raids, and captured individual fortresses. And one day, in February of 1192, he approached Jerusalem. The army reached the heights from which the Holy City was visible. But Richard knew that even if he could take Jerusalem, it would be impossible to hold it without a strong defense, sufficient supplies, and constant reinforcements from the sea. The papal goal of recapturing the Holy Sepulchre faded into the background in the face of strategic reality. The second approach to Jerusalem took place in the summer of the same year, but even then, despite pressure from the knights, clergy, and allies, Richard again rejected the attack. This decision was difficult. It caused discontent in the camp, disputes among the commanders, but it allowed the army to be preserved. Richard chose to conserve his strength for negotiations, rather than squander it in an assault doomed to the subsequent abandonment of the city. Meanwhile, Saladin strengthened the fortresses, held the front, and himself was increasingly inclined to the need to make peace. The Muslim forces were at their limit. Recent victories did not cover all the losses, and resources were dwindling. Jerusalem had to be saved, but he understood that if he did not reach an agreement, there would be a new invasion and a new assault. In September, an agreement was signed between the parties. It was not called peace, but in fact meant the end of the war. The coastal cities from Jaffa to Tyre remained under Christian control. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims were given free access to the shrines. The truce was concluded for a period of 3 years and 8 months. Chronicles say that after signing the treaty, Saladin and Richard again exchanged gifts. One sent a hunting falcon to the camp, the other, a silk robe. They never saw each other in person, but each knew that he was dealing with a worthy opponent. Their relationship became a symbol not only of military struggle, but also of a rare example of mutual respect between enemies, which was remembered by both the East and the West. Thus ended one of the most famous episodes of the Third Crusade. The war brought neither a decisive victory nor a final defeat, but it left behind the image of two men, not just warriors, but rulers who understood the value of peace and the meaning of honor. When Richard left the shores of the Holy Land, he had behind him not only battles, camps, sieges, and diplomatic negotiations, but also years that had changed his destiny and the face of Europe. He left Jaffa with the sense of duty fulfilled. Although Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, the honor of the cross was preserved, the coast was fortified, and pilgrims were guaranteed access to the shrines. Now the king had to return home, to an empire he had not seen for almost 4 years, where the enemies were already raising their heads and where his name was becoming a symbol of either hope or threat, depending on who the people were talking to. He set out by sea, but a violent storm scattered him from his ship, and the vessel carrying the king was washed up on the Adriatic coast, not far from the lands belonging to the Babenbergs, Dukes of Austria. It was with one of them, Leopold I, that Richard had already had a conflict, which was remembered by both sides. During the siege of Acre, after the capitulation of the city, Leopold had planted his banner next to the royal standards, which Richard perceived as an expression of inappropriate vanity. On his orders, the Austrian banner was torn down and thrown from the tower. For the proud duke, this was a public humiliation that he did not forgive. Aware of the danger, Richard did not cross Europe with the royal regalia. Disguised as a merchant and taking a false name, he set off toward the German Empire, hoping to pass through the land incognito. However, the journey turned out to be a failure. At the end of December, he was identified. According to one legend, his servant, unable to conceal his courtly habits, aroused suspicion by purchasing an expensive glove or an overly luxurious belt. In any case, Richard was captured by Duke Leopold's men and imprisoned in Dürnstein Castle, a gloomy fortress perched on a cliff above the Danube. From that moment on, his fate was in the hands of his enemies. The Duke of Austria had no formal right to hold the king, but he soon handed the prisoner over to Emperor Henry VI, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. He, hostile to Anglo-Norman influence in Europe and interested in strengthening his own position, saw in Richard a hostage capable of bringing not only political influence, but also a huge sum of money. Richard's capture became a sensation. The news quickly spread throughout Europe, causing alarm in England, jubilation in France, and excitement at the court of John Lackland. Richard's younger brother, who had long dreamed of the crown, did not hide his intentions. He began to establish contacts with Philip II, hoping to seize power with his support. From France, the emperor received proposals not to release Richard, to keep him in custody as long as possible, and in return to receive gold and political concessions. A political crisis began in England. The regents appointed by Richard were losing authority, the barons hesitated, and the people were worried. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the king's mother, immediately entered the fight. Despite her age, she energetically joined the negotiations, wrote letters to Rome, to the emperor, to Pope Celestine II, proving that the arrest of a Christian king was sacrilege, violating the laws of the church. The Pope heeded her words and excommunicated Duke Leopold from the church for participating in the capture of Richard. But this did not change the prisoner's position. Meanwhile, Emperor Henry VI demanded a ransom of 100,000 marks of pure silver, which was approximately equal to 3 annual incomes of the English crown. In addition, a second part of the ransom was provided in case of delay or political concessions. Collecting such a sum became a colossal task. A special tax was declared in England. Churches handed over their chalices, monasteries donated treasures, and ordinary people handed over silver coins and jewelry. The country barely recovered from the taxes of the Crusade, paid again, but now to get its king back. Richard meanwhile spent almost a year and a half in captivity. He was first in Dürnstein, then in Trifles Castle. The conditions of his detention were not the most cruel, but not privileged either. He lived under guard, did not have freedom of correspondence, but, as some chroniclers claim, he retained good spirits. There were rumors that he composed songs in Occitan, and one day he was heard by the faithful troubadour Blondel, who was looking for his master, humming familiar melodies at the walls of each castle. This story became a beautiful symbol of loyalty, although historians consider it a late literary insertion, lacking documentary evidence. By the spring of 1194, most of the ransom had been collected. The emperor, pleased with the result, agreed to release the prisoner. On February 4th, Richard was released and, accompanied by his entourage, set out towards England. He crossed France under guard, met with his mother, and arrived in England in March, where he was greeted with joy and relief. His regalia were immediately returned to him. He confirmed his rights to the throne, gathered a council, and began preparing for a new stage in his life. But returning to his homeland was not the end of his worries. His brother, who dreamed of usurping power, was waiting for him. The King of France was waiting for him, with whom a new war was now about to begin. And Richard himself, who had gone from coronation to captivity, had to prove again that the nickname Lionheart belonged not only to legend, but also to a living person, capable of holding a crown on the edge of a sword. When Richard the Lionheart set foot on English soil, he was greeted not only with joy, but also with anxiety. The country was waiting for the king, but did not know in what form he would return, a tired prisoner or a powerful sovereign. He arrived at the port of Southampton in early March and almost immediately went to Winchester, where his second coronation took place. This gesture, more symbolic than political, was necessary to emphasize the continuity of legitimacy and demonstrate that, despite captivity, royal power was not interrupted. But Richard did not stay in England long. He remained in the kingdom for only a few weeks, during which he confirmed his rights to the throne, held a meeting with the barons, appointed loyalists to key posts, and exacted fines from traitors. His brother John, implicated in the conspiracy and ready for usurpation, was publicly pardoned for political reasons, but deprived of real influence. Richard's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, continued to play an important role in government, especially in the southern provinces, where her authority remained unshakable. The king's main task was now again France. He left England in May 1194, crossed the English Channel, and soon found himself on the fields of Normandy, where a difficult and stubborn struggle was underway with the French king Philip II. During the years that Richard spent in captivity, the French crown strengthened its position, captured several key cities, and received the support of some of the Angevin barons. The struggle, which began as a defense of the Plantagenet heritage, was now developing into a full-scale war for political balance in Western Europe. Richard once again showed that he had not forgotten either strategic thinking or knightly passion. He personally led campaigns, strengthened garrisons, concluded temporary alliances, and, when necessary, dealt unexpected blows to the enemy's rear. diplomacy became more active under him. Ambassadors were sent to the Dukes of Brittany, the Counts of Toulouse, and even the German Emperor to obtain either support or neutrality. Throughout the conflict, he demonstrated amazing endurance and clarity of purpose to hold Normandy, to return Anjou and Maine, to prevent Philip from finally pushing the English out of the mainland. One of the main symbols of this struggle was the castle of Chateau Gaillard, the Merry Castle, as the English themselves called it. Construction began in 1196 and was completed 2 years later. Erected on a cliff above the Seine, at a strategically important point between Rouen and the border of the French kingdom, it became not just a fortress, but a challenge to Philip. Richard personally supervised the construction, chose the site, approved the plans, and, according to chroniclers, visited the construction site every day. He invested not only public money in the project, but also his reputation. Chateau Gaillard was to become a bastion that would not only stop the enemy, but would also show that the English had come to the continent for a time. The castle was built using the latest defensive ideas, a complex system of walls, ring defense, internal bastions, reservoirs, and stone bridges. This was the first time in Western Europe that the architecture of a fortress was so well thought out in a military sense. Its construction cost a considerable amount of money, but Richard considered it necessary. One day he exclaimed, "If the walls were made of butter, I would still hold them." This phrase, recorded by chroniclers, later became a symbol of his perseverance. In parallel with the war and construction, Richard pursued an active domestic policy. He redistributed lands, strengthened ties with the vassals, restored the rights of churches, and controlled trade. In Normandy, he established judicial commissions to eliminate abuses. He also reformed the tax system in his French possessions to ensure funding for the war. Despite the fact that he had no heirs, he built a system that could ensure the continuity of power. At the same time, Eleanor remained his main confidant in the southern part of the empire. By 1198, Richard again controlled most of the territories lost during the years of captivity. Philip II suffered several defeats, was forced to retreat, and sign temporary agreements, but Richard was not going to stop. He knew that final victory required not only battles, but also the elimination of pockets of internal resistance. In the spring of 1199, he led a small company to Limousin where one of the local barons, Aymar of Limoges, refused to recognize royal authority and fortified himself in his castle of Chalus-Chabrol. According to rumors, a large treasure was hidden within the walls of the castle, and Richard, counting on a quick and profitable operation, arrived at the fortress with limited forces. He did not expect serious resistance. However, the siege dragged on, and during one of the rounds of the camp, on March 26th, the king was wounded by a crossbow bolt. This event marked the beginning of the story that we will tell in the next chapter. The story of the last spurt of a man whose heart truly belonged not to the throne, but to the battlefield. The siege of the castle of chalus-Chabrol in the occupied territory began as a local punitive expedition against a rebellious vassal. King Richard, in the midst of his protracted struggle with the King of France, sought to suppress the center of resistance and take the treasures allegedly hidden in the castle. On March 26th, during an evening round of the position, Richard, as often happened, was near the advanced units without special protection and escort. From the castle, a crossbowman fired an arrow from the fortress wall, which hit the king in the left shoulder. At first, the wound did not seem dangerous. The king did not lose consciousness, maintained his composure, and even allowed himself to be treated without delay. However, during the extraction of the arrow, the court surgeon caused additional damage, and soon the wound began to fester. Gangrene set in. The king was carried to a tent, where his condition gradually worsened. As the swelling and fever intensified, Richard realized the inevitability of the outcome. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, urgently arrived to see him. Despite her advanced age, she spent his last days next to her son, listening to his orders, comforting him, and staying close to the very end. According to chroniclers, the king retained his clarity of mind until the end, made a will, appointed his younger brother John as his successor, and ordered that the crossbowman who shot him be forgiven. The name of the shooter is preserved in the chronicles, Pierre Baziel. According to stories, he was a young man who acted on his own initiative without an order from his master. Richard, upon learning of this, is said to have said, "Let him go. He has done God's will." However, after the king's death, the commander of the siege ordered Pierre to be brutally executed, despite the king's pardon. Richard died on the evening of April 6, 1199, 11 days after being wounded. His last words were addressed to his mother, "Do not weep, mother, for I die like a king." The phrase may be a legend, but it is deeply rooted in the historical image of a monarch who met death with dignity. Richard's body, at his request, was buried in several parts. His heart, as a symbol of loyalty to Normandy, was sent to Rouen, the capital of his mainland possessions, where it was buried in a silver reliquary in the cathedral. His entrails were left in Chalus as a sign that his life had ended there, and the body itself was taken to the province of Fontevraud, next to the remains of his father and later his mother. There, in the main hall of the monastery, tombstones were erected, the kings lying side by side, father and son, reunited after death. Despite years of political and personal confrontation, Richard's death had historical significance. His brother John Lackland, who became king, turned out to be weaker, less decisive, and was unable to hold on to the vast Anglo-French Empire created by Henry II and strengthened by Richard. Just a few years after the death of the Lionheart, most of the continental territories were under the control of the French crown. Richard's death became a symbolic end to an era, a knightly, impulsive personality based on personal courage and authority. However, his memory did not disappear with his death. Already in the 13th century, troubadours sang ballads about the Crusader king. Chroniclers created a romantic image of a warrior, poet, and just ruler. One of the most popular legends was the story of the faithful minstrel Blondel, who searched for the captured Richard in the castles of Europe, singing their common song at each tower until he heard a familiar voice in response. This story is almost certainly fictitious, but it has become part of the image of Richard, a king who cannot be forgotten. In English memory, Richard remained the embodiment of the knightly ideal: strong, generous, courageous. Despite the fact that he spent most of his reign outside of England, rarely visiting the island, his image was sung as a symbol of national greatness. Richard's image was used in art, literature, and even politics, presenting him as a standard of royal courage. Over the centuries, Richard's body rested peacefully in Fontevraud, but his heart became a real cult object. In the 19th century, during restoration work in Rouen Cathedral, the ark containing his heart was opened, and inside, they found a dried-out but preserved organ, surrounded by incense, frankincense, plant remains, and silver dust, exactly as Christian martyrs were buried. Scientists confirmed the authenticity of the find, and once again words were heard about Richard not as a ruler, but as a legend. Thus ended the life of Richard I, nicknamed the Lionheart, a man whose fate combined poetry and politics, cruelty and generosity, victories and losses. He did not die in battle, but with a weapon in his hand, and until his last breath, he remained true to himself. His throne passed to his brother, but his name remained in the centuries as an echo of an era in which the sword meant more than the crown, and the word of the king was stronger than the walls. Thanks for listening, story.